Rebecca Carter woke to the sound of her alarm already ringing for the second time, sharp and insistent in the half-dark of the bedroom. For a split second, she didn't know where she was. Then the familiar ceiling, the faint hum of traffic from the street below, and the warmth of another body beside her pulled everything into place. She glanced at the clock and felt her stomach drop. She was late. She sat up too fast, pushing the blanket aside, her thoughts instantly scattering. The morning routine she usually followed without thinking now felt rushed and clumsy. She moved through the apartment with hurried steps, opening drawers, searching for clothes, checking her phone again as if the time might somehow change. Her heart beat faster with every minute she imagined slipping away. From the kitchen came the quiet sounds of movement. The coffee maker clicked on. A cabinet door closed softly. Rebecca paused, then exhaled. Jason was already awake. She hurried into the bathroom, brushing her teeth while mentally listing everything she needed to do once she reached the office. Today mattered. She had a full schedule, responsibilities she couldn't afford to mishandle. The pressure pressed in from all sides, familiar and exhausting. When she stepped back into the kitchen, Jason Miller was standing by the counter, calm and unhurried, wearing the old t-shirt he usually slept in. He had already set a mug on the table, steam curling lazily upward. On a plate beside it sat a toasted sandwich, cut diagonally the way she liked, the cheese already melting between the layers. "You overslept," he said gently, not as a criticism, but as a simple observation. His voice was warm, steady. "I know," Rebecca replied, rubbing her forehead. "I don't know how it happened." He smiled at her, the kind of smile that never seemed forced. "Sit. At least have a few sips. You'll feel better." She hesitated, then did as he said, wrapping her hands around the mug. The warmth seeped into her fingers. The first sip of coffee grounded her, slowed her breathing. Jason moved easily around her, adjusting things without being asked, sliding her bag closer to the door, placing her keys where she wouldn't forget them. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. It was a small gesture, familiar and unremarkable, yet it filled a quiet space inside her she hadn't always known how to soothe. "You've got this," he said. "You always do." Rebecca smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude she didn't stop to question. With Jason, things felt simple, safe. He didn't demand explanations or reassurance. He didn't ask her to prove anything. He was just there, steady and attentive in a way that felt natural. As she finished the last sip of coffee, her thoughts drifted, as they sometimes did, to Daniel Brooks. The memory no longer cut as sharply as it once had, but it still existed, like a scar that had healed but never fully disappeared. Daniel had been her past. Their breakup had left her drained, questioning herself, wondering if love always came with conditions she couldn't meet. For a long time after that, she had carried the weight of uncertainty. She had doubted her instincts, her choices, even her right to want stability without guilt. Jason had come into her life quietly, without promises or pressure. He hadn't tried to replace anything. He had simply offered companionship, warmth, and the sense that she didn't have to brace herself all the time. With him, she felt like she could breathe again. She stood, smoothing her blouse, and Jason stepped closer, wrapping an arm briefly around her waist. He looked into her eyes, his expression open and affectionate. "Have a good day," he said. "You too," she replied, leaning in to kiss him. The kiss was soft, unhurried, reassuring in its familiarity. As she slipped on her coat and opened the door, Rebecca felt calm settle over her. The rush of the morning no longer mattered. She felt centered, supported, certain. Whatever challenges waited for her outside this apartment, she believed she was facing them from solid ground. She walked out convinced of one simple truth. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, with the man she was meant to be with, moving forward into a life that finally felt right Outside the building, the morning air felt cooler than Rebecca had expected. The city was already awake, cars moving steadily, footsteps echoing on the sidewalk, the familiar rhythm of Chicago beginning another workday. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and took a few brisk steps toward the street before something tugged at the back of her mind. She slowed, then stopped. A faint unease surfaced, the kind that came not from danger, but from a quiet doubt. Rebecca pulled her phone from her bag and opened her calendar, her thumb hovering for a moment before tapping the screen. She scanned the schedule once, then again more carefully. Her breath caught. The meeting. It wasn't today. She frowned, rereading the entry. Tomorrow. The time had been changed earlier in the week. She remembered it now vaguely, an email, a quick acknowledgement between other messages. She had even reset her alarm because of it. She hadn't overslept at all. She had woken up exactly when she was supposed to. Rebecca let out a slow breath, the tension in her shoulders easing almost immediately. The rush, the panic, the tightness in her chest all drained away, leaving behind a mild, almost embarrassed irritation. She shook her head at herself, a small, quiet laugh escaping her lips. So much drama for nothing, she murmured. For a moment she stood there, letting the relief settle. She had time, plenty of it, no need to hurry, no reason to run. Her thoughts drifted back upstairs, to the apartment she had just left, to Jason standing calmly in the kitchen with the coffee already made. The image softened something inside her. She imagined going back, knocking lightly, surprising him. Maybe they would sit together for a few minutes. Maybe they would talk without rushing, without schedules pressing in. She thought about asking him how he was feeling, really feeling, about the treatment, about whether he was sleeping well. Jason didn't like to dwell on it, but she wanted to know. She wanted to be there for him, the way he was always there for her. The idea felt comforting. Rebecca turned back toward the building and stepped inside the lobby. The familiar scent of polished floors and faint detergent greeted her. She walked toward the elevator and pressed the call button, waiting as the small light blinked slowly above the doors. Nothing happened. She checked her phone again, then glanced at the display. The elevator was moving, stopping on multiple floors. She knew this routine well. The building was busy in the mornings, and the elevator had developed a habit of lagging, sometimes stopping for no clear reason, sometimes taking longer than it should. Rebecca sighed softly. She could wait, but the thought of standing there doing nothing suddenly felt unnecessary. She wasn't in a hurry anymore. Her gaze shifted toward the stairwell door at the end of the corridor. She hesitated for only a second before pushing it open. The stairwell was quiet, the air cooler, the concrete steps stretching upward in even, predictable lines. She started climbing, her pace unhurried, her thoughts light. It was just a few floors, nothing unusual, nothing worth a second thought. At that moment, the decision felt entirely ordinary, almost forgettable. Just another small choice in a morning full of them. Rebecca had no way of knowing that she had already crossed a line she would never step back over. Rebecca moved up the stairs at an easy pace, one hand resting lightly on the railing. Her thoughts were still soft, unguarded, drifting between the quiet comfort of the morning and the simple pleasure of having time she hadn't expected. She imagined Jason's reaction when he saw her again so soon. The idea of surprising him made her smile. She was halfway up the next flight when she heard his voice. At first, the sound registered without meaning, familiar, close, comforting by habit alone. Her smile lingered as she took another step, assuming he was talking to someone from work or answering a routine call. She was just about to call his name when something in his tone stopped her cold. Jason wasn't speaking the way he usually did. His voice was lower, stripped of warmth. The easy cadence she knew so well was gone, replaced by sharpness and restraint, like a blade kept deliberately sheathed. Rebecca paused, her foot hovering above the next step, her body suddenly alert. She leaned back slightly, instinctively retreating into the shadow of the stairwell wall. Jason was standing on the landing below, his back to her, phone pressed to his ear. She couldn't hear the other voice, only the hollow echo of his words bouncing faintly off concrete. Even without context, they landed with unsettling weight. "No," he said quietly. Irritation threaded through every syllable. "I'm not letting this go." Rebecca's chest tightened. She told herself she was misreading it. Everyone sounded different when they were frustrated. Everyone needed to vent sometimes. But as she listened, the unease grew, crawling slowly up her spine. "I didn't forget," Jason continued. "I'm just waiting for the right moment." Rebecca's fingers curled around the railing. The stairwell felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Jason shifted his weight, pacing once, then stopping. His voice dropped even further, almost conversational in its calm. "She humiliated me," he said, "and she's going to pay for it." Rebecca's breath caught. Pay. The word echoed in her head, sharp and unmistakable. This wasn't about an argument. This wasn't casual anger. There was intention behind it. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Don't worry about the money. That part's already handled. She owes me. For everything." Rebecca pressed her back against the wall, heart pounding now, loud enough that she was certain he would hear it. She stared down at the steps, at the worn edges of concrete that suddenly seemed unreal, as if she were watching the scene from a distance rather than standing inside it. Jason had never spoken like this around her, never with this edge, this certainty. "You think I care what she says," he went on. "She can scream all she wants. By the time this is over, she'll do exactly what I need her to do." Rebecca's stomach twisted. Her mind scrambled to fill in the missing pieces, but the fragments refused to settle into anything safe. Whoever Jason was talking about, he wasn't angry in the way people were angry when they felt hurt. He was controlled, calculating. "I'm getting paid back," he said, "one way or another." The words sent a chill through her. Revenge, money, control. Each phrase stacked neatly on top of the last, forming something dark and deliberate. Rebecca felt frozen in place, her body refusing to obey even the simplest instinct to move. She wanted to step back, quietly, to retreat up the stairs and pretend she hadn't heard a thing. But she couldn't. The sound of his voice held her there, rooted to the spot. He stopped pacing again, lowering his voice further, almost to a murmur. "She thinks she's safe," he said. "That's the funny part." Rebecca's hands began to shake. This wasn't venting. This wasn't exaggeration or bravado. Jason wasn't blowing off steam. He was outlining something, measured, intentional, already decided. The call ended abruptly. Jason pulled the phone away from his ear, slipped it into his pocket, and exhaled as if nothing of consequence had happened. He turned toward the apartment door, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable from where Rebecca stood. He disappeared inside without another word. Rebecca remained on the stairs, motionless, her pulse racing, her thoughts colliding into one another. The man who had kissed her goodbye only minutes earlier, who had spoken gently and moved through their shared space with practiced care, had just revealed a voice she had never heard before. And she knew, with a clarity that left her cold and hollow, that she hadn't accidentally overheard a moment of weakness. She had overheard a plan. Rebecca stayed where she was, pressed into the corner of the stairwell, every muscle tense. She hadn't meant to keep listening. She told herself she should leave, should turn and walk away before she heard anything else. But her body didn't respond. Her mind clung to the sound of Jason's voice as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. He spoke again, more freely now, as though the person on the other end of the line had stopped arguing. "Caroline," he said, the name slipping out with unmistakable contempt. "You remember her." Rebecca's heart lurched. The name was unfamiliar, but the way he said it, sharp, dismissive, made it clear this wasn't a passing reference. "She thinks she can cut me out," Jason continued. "Pretend I don't exist. Like I'll just go away." He scoffed quietly, the sound dry and humorless. Rebecca leaned her head back against the wall, her thoughts racing. Caroline, a woman, someone from his past. Jason had mentioned people before, old coworkers, friends, acquaintances, but never like this, never with this kind of bitterness. "I don't even need to touch her," he went on. "Not directly. I just need the right leverage." Rebecca's stomach tightened. "The kid's the key," Jason said, his voice steady, almost bored. "She knows it. I know it." Rebecca felt as if the air had been knocked from her lungs. The word echoed in her head, refusing to settle into anything harmless. Kid. Child. Her thoughts stumbled, trying to reject what she was hearing, but the pieces were already locking into place. "She won't fight me," Jason continued. "She can't. Not when she knows I can take him." Rebecca's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a sound she didn't even realize she had made. Take him. The implication was unmistakable now, stripped of any remaining ambiguity. Jason let out a low laugh, soft but unmistakably pleased. "Relax," he said. "The law's on my side. My name's on the birth certificate. I'm his father. I can take my own child wherever I want." The words landed with brutal clarity. Rebecca's vision blurred. Her chest burned as if her heart were trying to force its way out. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a distorted fragment of an argument. Jason was talking about using a child, someone's child, as a tool. "Exactly," he said, responding to something Rebecca couldn't hear. "She'll pay. Every dollar she owes me. And more. If I feel like it." He laughed again, louder this time, unrestrained. It was the sound that finally shattered something inside Rebecca. Not the words themselves, but the ease with which he spoke them. The certainty, the satisfaction. The man who had made her breakfast minutes earlier was speaking about extortion as if it were routine, about fear as if it were currency, about a child as if he were nothing more than a bargaining chip. Jason's tone softened suddenly, almost amused. "She won't go to the police," he said. "She's smarter than that. She knows what I can do." Rebecca's knees buckled. She slid down the wall, collapsing onto the cold concrete step, no longer able to support her own weight. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. This couldn't be real. Her mind grasped desperately for some other explanation, some missing context that would make the conversation less monstrous. But there was none. Every sentence had been clear, deliberate, calculated. The call ended with a final, dismissive murmur from Jason. He slipped the phone into his pocket and stood still for a moment, as if collecting himself. Then he turned and walked toward the apartment door. Rebecca watched through a haze as he unlocked it and stepped inside, closing it behind him with the same casual motion he always used. No hesitation, no trace of the man who had just spoken in the stairwell. To anyone watching, he might have been returning from a perfectly ordinary phone call. Rebecca remained where she was, staring at the closed door, her body shaking. She didn't follow him. She couldn't. The space between who she thought Jason was and who he had revealed himself to be had become impossibly wide. Crossing it felt dangerous, unthinkable. As she sat there on the cold steps, the realization settled with crushing force. She had built a life beside someone she didn't know at all. She had trusted him, loved him, shared her home with him, and all the while, there had been another person beneath the surface, watching, waiting, calculating. The sense of safety she had carried with her that morning fractured completely, splintering into fear and disbelief. Rebecca wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold together what remained, knowing with terrible certainty that nothing about her life would ever feel the same again. Rebecca remained on the stairwell, the cold seeping through the fabric of her clothes, but she barely noticed it. Her body was there, trembling, while her mind drifted somewhere else, pulled backward by a memory she hadn't invited but had never fully escaped. Daniel Brooks. The name surfaced quietly without warning, and with it came the familiar ache she had learned to live around rather than through. She closed her eyes, and the present loosened its grip, replaced by the slow, unfolding recollection of how everything had once begun. She and Daniel had met in university, in a place that felt full of possibility. They had been young, ambitious in different ways, still discovering who they were meant to become. Daniel had been thoughtful, reserved, intensely focused. He studied engineering, spoke carefully, and carried himself with a seriousness that had felt grounding to her back then. Rebecca, studying law, had been sharper, more outspoken, already driven by a sense of responsibility and expectation. They fell in love gradually without drama. Late-night study sessions turned into shared meals. Shared meals turned into long conversations about the future. They supported each other in ways that felt natural, Daniel helping her with subjects she struggled to understand, Rebecca encouraging him when he doubted himself. For a long time it felt balanced, but as the years passed, the differences between them grew harder to ignore. Rebecca's career moved quickly. Opportunities came early, aided by her background, but earned through relentless work. Daniel worked just as hard, but his progress was slower, more fragile. He felt it deeply, even when he tried not to show it. The imbalance settled between them like an unspoken third presence, shaping their conversations, their silences, their choices. Rebecca had tried to be careful. She avoided talking about money, about promotions, about the things she knew made Daniel uncomfortable. She told herself that love meant patience, that these things would even out with time. Daniel told himself something else, that a man who couldn't provide had already failed. The argument that ended everything had come on an ordinary evening, without raised voices at first. They had been walking through a park, Daniel talking about work, about an offer he was considering. Rebecca listened, nodded, encouraged him, but her thoughts were elsewhere, circling a question she had been holding back for months. When she finally asked it whether they should live together, it felt like a step forward, a simple, logical progression. She even offered her apartment, thinking she was removing an obstacle, not creating one. Daniel's reaction had been immediate and unmistakable. He had gone still, his expression closing in on itself. He took her face in his hands, a gesture she usually loved, but this time it felt heavy, almost final. He told her he wanted the same things, that he thought about their future constantly. Then he told her he wasn't ready. He said he needed time to become someone worthy of her, that he couldn't accept living in her space, supported by her stability, even temporarily. He framed it as responsibility, as dignity, as love. Rebecca remembered how she had tried to argue, how her voice had risen despite herself. She told him money didn't matter to her, that partnership meant standing together, not waiting for perfection. Daniel shook his head, pain written plainly across his face. He said stepping aside was the right thing to do. At the time, Rebecca had heard sacrifice. What she felt, though, was abandonment. The breakup had hollowed her out. The days afterward blurred together, each one heavy and slow. She remembered lying in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, unable to summon interest in anything. Friends had come, offering comfort, anger on her behalf, assurances that she deserved better. She nodded, listened, but nothing filled the absence Daniel left behind. What hurt most wasn't just losing him. It was the sense that something honest had been lost, something flawed, yes, but real. Daniel hadn't lied to her. He hadn't manipulated her. He had been transparent about his fears, even when those fears cost them everything. Sitting on the stairwell now, Rebecca felt the weight of that contrast settle painfully into place. Daniel's honesty had wounded her, but it had never frightened her. Jason's words, spoken with such casual cruelty, had done both. One man had stepped away because he believed he wasn't enough. The other stayed close while hiding a capacity for harm she couldn't have imagined. The memory didn't bring comfort. It brought clarity. Rebecca opened her eyes, the present rushing back and around her. The echo of Jason's laughter still rang in her ears. The comparison was unavoidable, and it left her feeling raw, exposed, and deeply unsettled. The past she thought she had escaped had returned, not to pull her backward, but to show her with painful precision what she had failed to recognize until now. The memory shifted again, carrying Rebecca further back, to the night she first met Jason Miller. It had been a time when everything still hurt, even if she pretended otherwise. The breakup with Daniel was fresh then, the ache still sharp enough to catch her off guard in quiet moments. She had agreed to go out only because her friends refused to let her stay home alone any longer. The rock bar had been loud, crowded, and dimly lit, filled with the thrum of music and the restless energy of people looking to forget something. Rebecca had sat slightly apart at first, nursing a drink she barely touched, watching the room without really seeing it. She felt invisible and exposed at the same time, unsure of how to exist as someone newly alone. Then Jason had stepped onto the small stage for karaoke. He wasn't dressed in anything remarkable, worn jeans, an old t-shirt, but he carried himself with an easy confidence that drew attention. His voice wasn't perfect, but it was strong, full of feeling, and when he sang, his eyes found Rebecca's almost immediately. He held her gaze through the song, smiling as if the room had narrowed down to just the two of them. It made her laugh, surprised despite herself. When he finished, he bowed exaggeratedly, even dropping to one knee in front of her as the crowd laughed and applauded. Rebecca felt heat rush to her face, a mixture of embarrassment and something warmer, lighter. For the first time in weeks, she felt seen. They talked afterward, shouting over the music, leaning close without discomfort. Jason was funny, quick-witted, generous with compliments. He called her beautiful in a way that felt playful rather than demanding. When he learned her name, he repeated it as if it mattered. That night, Rebecca went home smiling, the tightness in her chest eased just enough to let her sleep. Jason didn't rush things. He texted the next day, then the day after that. He listened when she spoke. He told stories about his life, jobs that came and went, friends scattered across the city, mistakes he admitted to freely, as if honesty were second nature to him. Compared to Daniel's careful restraint, Jason felt open, uncomplicated. They started seeing each other regularly. Jason brought laughter back into her routine, filling spaces that had felt hollow for too long. With him, she didn't feel like she had to prove anything. He enjoyed the moment without asking where it led. When the idea of living together came up, it felt natural. Jason suggested it first, casual and hopeful. Rebecca agreed, relieved by how easy the decision seemed. She made one quiet choice then, one she barely acknowledged even to herself. She didn't tell Jason about the apartment she owned. She spoke of renting, of splitting costs, of keeping things simple. After Daniel, she wanted to avoid anything that might reopen old wounds. She didn't want money to become a measure of worth again. Jason didn't question it. He didn't bristle at her car or her work schedule. He joked about things instead, asking to drive sometimes, making light of differences that Daniel had carried like a burden. His indifference felt refreshing. Life with Jason was light. He enjoyed music, late nights, spontaneous plans. He pulled her into a world that asked nothing of her except that she show up. When he told her he loved her, it felt unforced, sincere. Rebecca believed him. She believed she was healing. Looking back now, the warmth of those memories felt tainted, threaded through with something she hadn't noticed then. Jason had appeared precisely when she was weakest, when she was most willing to believe in relief rather than truth. He had offered affection, ease, and attention in perfect measure. Sitting on the stairwell, Rebecca understood what she hadn't been ready to see before. Jason hadn't rescued her from her pain. He had found her in it. The realization didn't erase the good moments, but it reframed them, casting a long shadow over everything she thought she knew. The man who had felt like salvation had been something else entirely, and the safety she believed she had found was only an illusion. Carefully constructed and patiently maintained, the shift came quietly without warning. Jason began to complain of exhaustion first, an unusual heaviness that lingered no matter how much he slept. Then came the dizziness, the shortness of breath after even minor exertion. At first, Rebecca dismissed it as stress, the result of long days and irregular work. Jason laughed it off himself, insisting it was nothing, but it didn't pass. One morning, he sat on the edge of the bed longer than usual, his shoulders slumped, his face pale in a way Rebecca couldn't ignore. That was when she insisted on a doctor's appointment. Jason resisted at first, brushing off her concern, but eventually agreed. The visits multiplied quickly after that. Appointments, tests, follow-ups. Rebecca found herself sitting in waiting rooms she had never expected to enter, watching names appear on digital boards, listening for Jason's to be called. The language of medicine, diagnoses, treatment plans, probabilities felt foreign and unsettling. Each answer seemed to open the door to more questions. The costs came next. Insurance covered part of it, but not enough. There were procedures that required approval. Medications with price tags that made Rebecca's chest tighten. Recommendations that came with careful disclaimers. The healthcare system felt vast and impersonal, a maze designed to overwhelm even those who knew how to navigate complex systems. Jason changed during that time. He grew quieter, more subdued. The ease that once defined him faded, replaced by moments of visible fatigue. He spoke less about plans, about music, about the future. For the first time since she had known him, he looked small. Rebecca responded without hesitation. She rearranged her schedule, drove him to appointments, sat beside him as he waited for results. When the conversation turned, inevitably, to money, she didn't pause. She offered her savings as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Jason protested at first, his voice low, his eyes avoiding hers. He said he would find another way, that he didn't want to burden her. Rebecca insisted. She told him this was what partners did, that she believed in him, that his health mattered more than anything else. Eventually he accepted. He took the envelope of documents, the transfer confirmation, with a seriousness she hadn't seen before. He thanked her repeatedly, his voice thick with emotion. He promised he would repay every dollar as soon as he was able. He told her she was saving him. Rebecca believed him. The treatment began almost immediately. New medications, regular infusions, follow-up visits scheduled with precision. And slowly, so slowly she barely noticed at first, Jason improved. His color returned. His energy followed. The heaviness lifted. He joked again. He smiled more easily. He stopped speaking about the illness unless Rebecca asked. The gravity that had settled over them during those months began to thin, as if it had never been fully real. Rebecca felt relief wash over her, deep and genuine. She told herself the worst was behind them, that they had faced something difficult together and come through it stronger. Jason returned to work in small increments. He talked about plans again, about the things he wanted to do once he felt completely like himself. He looked healthy, confident. Now, sitting alone on the stairwell, Rebecca replayed those months with a different awareness. She saw how seamlessly everything had unfolded. The timing, the vulnerability, the way her instincts to protect and support had been activated so completely. Jason had never pressured her. He hadn't demanded anything. He had simply allowed her to step forward. She remembered the way he had accepted the money, not reluctantly, as she had believed, but decisively. The promise of repayment had sounded sincere. convincing, just uncertain enough to feel real. Looking back, the pattern was unmistakable. The illness had not only drawn her closer, it had secured his position in her life. It had deepened her investment, emotional and financial, at exactly the moment when trust mattered most. Rebecca's throat tightened. She didn't question the diagnosis itself. She had seen the doctors, the prescriptions, the appointments. But she questioned everything else now, the performance of fragility, the speed of recovery, the way the seriousness had faded as soon as the money had been transferred and the treatment underway. It all fit too well. Jason had appeared vulnerable when he needed to. He had allowed her to feel essential. He had let her believe she was saving him, when in reality, she had been giving him exactly what he required. The irony settled over her with a dull, aching weight. She had offered help out of love, out of faith in the man she thought she knew. He had accepted it as part of a plan she had never been meant to see. Rebecca lowered her head, closing her eyes. The clarity came not as a sharp revelation, but as a slow, devastating understanding. Everything had worked perfectly for him, and she had never stood a chance of seeing it until now. Rebecca did not return to the apartment. Instead, she walked out of the building with no clear plan except one urgent certainty. She had to find Caroline Hayes before Jason could act. The name echoed in her mind as she moved through the city, every step sharpened by the knowledge that time mattered now. She remembered hearing it once before, months earlier. In passing, Jason had mentioned it casually, almost carelessly, as if it held no weight. At the time, Rebecca hadn't asked questions. Now, that small memory became a thread she followed without hesitation. The address came together through fragments, an old remark, a location Jason had once complained about, a building Rebecca recognized from a night when her car had been in the shop and Jason had met her nearby. It wasn't certainty that led her there, but instinct. An instinct she had learned too late was not something she should ignore again. The building was quieter than she expected, tucked into a residential block that felt deliberately unremarkable. Rebecca hesitated at the entrance, steadying her breath before pressing the buzzer for the first apartment number she saw listed under Caroline Hayes. There was a pause. Then a woman's voice answered, cautious but controlled. "Yes." "My name is Rebecca," she said quickly. "I need to speak with Caroline Hayes. It's urgent." Silence stretched for a moment, long enough for Rebecca to wonder if the connection had dropped. Then the door buzzed open. The apartment door on the 7th floor was already ajar when Rebecca reached it. Caroline Hayes stood in the doorway, tall, composed, her expression guarded. She looked older than Rebecca by several years, her posture confident, her clothing understated but expensive. This was not someone accustomed to being intimidated. "You're not delivery," Caroline said, almost apologetically. "No," Rebecca replied. "I'm sorry to come like this. I wouldn't if it weren't serious." Before Caroline could respond, a small figure darted into the hallway. A little boy, no more than 4 years old, paused when he saw Rebecca, studying her with open curiosity. His dark hair and familiar eyes made Rebecca's chest tighten. "Theo." The resemblance was undeniable. "Back to your room, sweetheart," Caroline said gently. The boy hesitated, then obeyed without protest. The door closed behind him. Caroline turned back to Rebecca, her gaze sharper now. "Jason?" she asked quietly. Rebecca nodded. That was all it took. Caroline stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. The apartment was bright and meticulously kept, the kind of space that reflected stability and intention. Rebecca barely noticed the details. Her thoughts were already tumbling forward. They sat at the kitchen table, facing each other, strangers bound by a name neither wanted to say aloud. Rebecca spoke first. She told Caroline what she had overheard. Every word she could remember, every implication she had pieced together. She described Jason's confidence, his laughter, his certainty that the law was on his side. As she spoke, Caroline's expression shifted, not into shock, but into something darker and more resigned. When Rebecca finished, silence settled between them. "He'll do it," Caroline said finally. "Everything you heard. He means it." She took a breath, steadying herself, then began to speak. She told Rebecca how she had met Jason years earlier at a club on a night that felt harmless. He had been charming, attentive, unassuming. Younger than her, yes, but earnest. He made her feel admired in a way she hadn't realized she was missing. She spoke of how quickly she had trusted him, how easily he had slipped into her life. When she became pregnant, she believed it would change everything. For a while, Jason had stayed. Then he disappeared. He returned only when it suited him. Caroline described the years that followed, how Jason resurfaced again and again, each time with new demands. Money at first, framed as compensation, as something she owed him for ruining his life. When she resisted, the threats began, subtle at first, then explicit. He reminded her of his name on the birth certificate, of his rights, of how easily he could make things difficult. "I went to a lawyer," Caroline said. "They told me the truth. He has parental rights. That alone gives him leverage. The system doesn't move fast enough to protect you from someone like him. Not before damage is done." She had tried paying him off. It only made him bolder. She had moved cities once, then again. Each time he found her. The fear never fully left. Rebecca listened, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Everything Caroline said aligned perfectly with what she had overheard. The pattern was unmistakable now. They sat there, two women separated by circumstance but connected by the same deception. Neither had been chosen for who she was. They had been chosen for what they could provide. "He doesn't see people," Caroline said quietly. "He sees opportunities." Rebecca nodded, the truth of it settling heavily between them. In that moment, something shifted. The shock gave way to purpose. Fear remained, but it was no longer paralyzing. They were no longer alone in what they knew. And that knowledge, shared at last, became the first thing Jason no longer controlled. Jason moved quickly once he believed the moment had come. The careful patience he had shown for months gave way to urgency, sharpened by certainty. He was convinced the situation was under his control, that Caroline would fold the moment he applied pressure directly, that fear would do what words and demands had not. He had rehearsed it in his mind, step by step, confident that the law, the paperwork, and her past compliance would work in his favor. He chose a morning when he knew her routine. Caroline was leaving the building with Theo, her hand wrapped securely around her son's. When Jason appeared from between two parked cars, his presence was sudden but not frantic. He smiled as if they were meeting by chance, as if this were nothing more than an overdue conversation. "Morning," he said, his tone easy, practiced. "We need to talk." Caroline stopped. Her grip on Theo tightened, though her face remained calm. She had expected this moment. She had imagined it more times than she could count. Jason stepped closer, his posture relaxed, his confidence unmistakable. "You've had time," he continued. "I think you understand now that we can't avoid this." Theo shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension without understanding it. Jason's eyes flicked toward the boy, lingering just long enough to make his meaning clear. "I'm his father," Jason said quietly. "You know that gives me options." He reached out, not touching Theo, but close enough to make the threat unmistakable. That was when everything changed. Before Jason could take another step, two men moved into view from the opposite side of the street. They approached without hurry, without aggression. Their presence controlled and deliberate. One of them positioned himself between Jason and Caroline. The other stood slightly behind Jason, close enough that escape would require force. Jason's smile faltered. "What is this?" he asked, irritation flashing briefly across his face before he masked it again. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now," one of the men replied evenly. Caroline stepped back, placing Theo behind her, her voice steady as she spoke. "Take my son inside," she said softly. Theo obeyed immediately, guided by a third figure who had appeared at the building entrance. Jason's attention snapped back to Caroline, anger flickering beneath his composure. "You think this scares me," he said. "I'm within my rights." One of the men placed a firm hand on Jason's arm. The moment stretched. Taut and quiet, Jason tried to pull away. He was stronger than he looked, but not strong enough. The grip tightened, unyielding, professional. His irritation turned to alarm as he realized he was no longer directing the situation. "Let go," he said sharply. They didn't. What followed happened quickly and without spectacle. There were no raised voices, no dramatic struggle. Jason was guided toward a nearby vehicle, his protests contained, his movements restricted with practiced efficiency. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound. Caroline stood still, her breath controlled, her gaze fixed on the place where he had stood moments earlier. She didn't speak until the car pulled away, disappearing down the street. Only then did she allow herself to exhale. Jason was not harmed. He was not threatened with violence, but he was made to understand, with absolute clarity, that the game he believed he controlled had reached its end. The consequences were outlined plainly in terms he could not ignore. The risks he had dismissed were placed squarely in front of him, unavoidable and real. It was enough. Jason left the city within days. He packed his things quietly, abandoned the routines he had once treated so casually, and vanished from the spaces he had occupied with such confidence. His number went dead. His social presence disappeared. There were no messages, no attempts to explain or justify. He did not come back. For Caroline, the change was immediate and profound. The constant tension eased. The fear that had followed her from place to place loosened its grip. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that Theo could grow up without looking over his shoulder. Rebecca learned of Jason's departure indirectly through Caroline. There was no satisfaction in the news, only a deep, steady relief. The man who had woven himself so carefully into her life was gone, not with confrontation or confession, but with silence. Justice, she realized, did not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived quietly, decisively, and left nothing behind except the space to breathe again. Time did what it always did. It moved forward, quietly, without asking permission. In the weeks after Jason's disappearance, Rebecca focused on rebuilding the parts of her life that had gone untouched but unsettled. She returned to work fully, throwing herself into routines that felt familiar and grounding. The apartment no longer felt like a shared space, but it no longer felt dangerous either. It was simply hers again. The silence Jason left behind was not dramatic. There were no apologies, no explanations, no final messages. At first, that absence felt unsettling. Then, slowly, it began to feel like peace. Rebecca didn't rush to replace what she had lost. She didn't feel the need to explain it to anyone, either. She had learned that clarity did not always arrive with closure. Sometimes it arrived with distance. It was months later, on an ordinary afternoon, that she saw Daniel Brooks again. She had just finished work and stepped out onto the sidewalk near her office when she noticed him across the street, standing outside a small cafe. He looked familiar and different all at once. Leaner, more settled. There was a steadiness in the way he carried himself that hadn't been there before. Their eyes met, and recognition passed between them without urgency. They didn't rush toward each other. Daniel crossed the street slowly, as if giving her time to turn away if she wanted to. She didn't. They sat down together, cautious but open. Conversation came easily, without rehearsed explanations or emotional defenses. Daniel spoke about the years since they had parted, about building his own business, about setbacks and persistence, about learning to stand without measuring himself against someone else's success. "I had to figure out who I was without comparing," he said simply. "It took longer than I expected." Rebecca listened, hearing the honesty in his voice. There was no bitterness in him now, no shame disguised as pride. He spoke with the calm of someone who had faced himself and stayed. She told him, in broad strokes, what had happened since they last saw each other. She didn't dwell on Jason, only acknowledged the experience for what it had been. Daniel didn't interrupt or try to fix anything. He listened the way he always had, but without the weight he used to carry. Their reunion was not a return to the past. It was something new, built carefully without assumptions. They agreed to take things slowly, not out of fear, but out of respect for the people they had become. At the same time, Rebecca remained in touch with Caroline Hayes. Their connection deepened in ways Rebecca hadn't anticipated. What began as shared urgency grew into mutual understanding. They met occasionally for coffee, their conversations drifting easily between practical matters and quiet reflection. Theo grew more comfortable around Rebecca, his laughter filling spaces that had once felt heavy. They didn't talk about Jason unless it was necessary. He no longer defined their connection. What bound them now was survival, resilience, and the unspoken recognition of what it meant to be underestimated. Rebecca found strength in that friendship. It reminded her that trust could be rebuilt, not blindly, but thoughtfully with awareness. Looking back, Rebecca no longer framed what happened as a mistake. It had been an experience, painful and disorienting, but revealing. She understood now how easily warmth could be mistaken for safety, how charm could disguise intent, how vulnerability could invite both care and exploitation. She had also learned something else. Truth did not always arrive gently. Sometimes it shattered the version of reality you were clinging to. Sometimes it forced you to let go of someone you believed you needed. But in doing so, it cleared space for something real to grow. Rebecca stood one evening at her apartment window, watching the city settle into night, lights flickering on one by one. She felt no triumph, no urge to relive what had been lost or escaped. What she felt instead was steadiness. She had lost the wrong person, and in that loss, she had found her footing again. The future no longer felt like something she had to rush toward or defend herself from. It felt open, honest, earned. That, she realized, was what remained